So I want to bring into the program right now Dr. Robert Young with Doctors for Responsible Gun Ownership. Dr. Young, how are you, sir?
Hi, Cam. Good afternoon.
It's good talking with you. Now, I asked you to come on the program because I saw the story a few days ago about the rates of depression among young Americans reaching all-time highs. And I think that is a much bigger story as well. We have, these stories like what happened in Dixon, Illinois today, that the media really doesn't want to pay much attention to because, again, there was a school resource officer. There was a good guy with a gun, able to stop the bad guy with a gun. That doesn't fit their narrative. Thankfully, nobody besides the suspect was injured. And so the media loses interest in this real quickly. A story like
such a good news story, too, isn't it, Cam?
Absolutely it is. And again, like I said, it doesn't fit the narrative. So they don't really want to talk about it. But, I have a feeling that the more we learn about the suspect in this case, Dr. Young, we're going to learn that this didn't come out of the blue, that there likely were, again, got to be warning signs that there was a history here. And it strikes me as this is one of the problems that I have with how the media is driving our conversation, because they want to make everything about gun control. They want to tie it all back to, well, Dr. Young, if you give up your rights, or if I give up my rights, or you know what, if we somehow get the NRA to go away, then all these problems get solved. And I think at the end of the day, what we're talking about in many of these cases is a real mental health crisis. And because that's complicated, because that doesn't have any real simple solutions, the politicians don't want to talk about it. The media can't explain it in 10 seconds or less, so they really don't want to talk about it. But we need to be talking about this because it's the real root cause of so much of what's going on in our schools, not only incidents like what we saw in Dixon, Illinois today, but all kinds of trouble and problems in our schools.
Well, I'm sure that the things in this article you found and some others that covered the same topic are relevant to some of these attacks on schoolmates by students. As a matter of fact, as I've read about this, I'm not seeing any overt connection to guns per se, either as attackers or if they are being used anymore in these suicides or not. Mm-hmm. But these do point out the big issue is we need to care about people with mental illness. In this case, we're talking about depression, and we're talking about it in adolescence. And that is a time period, along with the oldest age of us, in which there has always been a spike in the incidence of suicide. And we understand that that's why, because adolescence is a very fraught time. There's hormonal issues, sexual issues, performance issues as people are moving farther in school, beginning to try to grab onto the identity that they want to develop through life, trying to separate from parents and family normally, but that, of course, can leave them feeling more isolated with whatever the problems they have. Turning to their peers for support can be a good thing, can be a bad thing, may not be able to identify the best places to get help because adults know more about that. So there is an awful lot going on here. They're pointing out that more girls than boys are experiencing this. That's generally always been true at all age groups. What I find fascinating, though, is the speculation that's accompanying these reports about whether the increase of suicidal thinking and acting in the adolescent age groups could relate to the fact that this is the first generation that has now been plugged in, wired in 100% of the time almost. Mm-hmm. And if that in itself may be, one, increasing their stress because of the constant barrage of demands to relate to through electronics to everyone all the time, as well as the risk that process can promote more self-doubt and less self-confidence when the relating doesn't go well. And then they don't have that person-to-person, face-to-face set of inputs that's so important in judging the emotional messaging back and forth.
I think that there is something to that, Dr. Young. There was a book that came out think it was last year, by a sociologist called iGen, and she looks a lot at the social research. These annual surveys, go back to the 1960s that track trends among adolescents. And what she found is that Jean Twenge is her name. And what she found is that along about 2012, she said she noticed, all these sorts of peaks and valleys that you typically see started becoming these huge spikes and these huge troughs as more adolescents were describing being either depressed or, talking about sort of depressive tendencies. And this did go hand in hand with over 50% of adolescents, I think, owning a smartphone. I think that was the threshold. And as you talk about the ubiquitous nature of these devices, she noted as well that about 2011 or so, juvenile homicide rates and the juvenile suicide rates, they actually cross paths. For decades, there were more juvenile homicides than juvenile suicides. But since the early 1990s, juvenile homicides have dropped by about 66%. Meanwhile, youth suicides have crept up, unfortunately. And, we are seeing a less violent generation, despite, again, the media narrative. By and large, we are seeing a less violent generation, but we are seeing more youth that are self-harming. And again, I think that goes back to, look, you can go after the inanimate object and you can try to, safe-proof every home where an adolescent lives, and you can get rid of, every sharp knife, every firearm, every razor, every pill, every, belt or any other thing that you could use to harm yourself. Or we could actually, again, as you say, deal with that individual and try to get that individual the help that they need, which is going to be more complicated. But I think at the end of the day, is it also likely to be more successful in actually treating the problem?
Of course, and it's what each individual deserves, too. We shouldn't be treating any of these problems as catch-all categories. We should be addressing each individual where they live, where they are in their life, with what their individual stressors are, what's wrong for them as a person facing their own problems, and help them in any way possible. I would hope also that as we've seen violence drop by adolescents, that is violence to others, I hope that means that some of the educational efforts we're all making about guns and about keeping them safe, being responsible, knowing who has access, being careful when you need to be careful, is making some headway, at least, making it harder for situations like Adam Lanza to kill his mother, steal her guns, and go do terrible things. I can't say that for sure, and it's something we all need to be on guard about, and we need to keep educating people as to how to do that well for their individual ownership situations too.
Talking again with Dr. Robert Young with Doctors for Responsible Gun Ownership. Hey, Doc, thank you so much. I appreciate you coming on the program, sir. It's so good talking with you today.
Always good, Cam. You all take care.
You too. Dr. Robert Young at Doctors for Responsible Gun Ownership. You can find them on Twitter at DRGOSAF.